Welcome to the series of Relational Database Management System. Myself is Fatima Rafiq, Assistant Professor, Abedan Amdas Senior College, BCA Department. We have already started with the transaction management, that is unit number 3. We have covered the introduction of transaction. Today we will see the state of different kind of state of transactions. Whenever we see the transaction is actually being started, its execution, it starts its execution, that is the beginning of the transaction. Then once the transaction is actually getting started, we will be having a number of read and number of write instruction. Okay, actually before going to the state of transaction, let me just give you an idea that what are the different kind of transaction operations we can have. So when we consider the transaction operations is actually, there are four operations which we will consider. Number one is the read operation. The read operation is actually reading the value from the database, and it is stored it in the buffer area in the main memory. Like for example, if you are doing reading A, so what it means that the database, the read value, what it will do, it will go to the database, it will find the value of A, it will read the value, and at the same time it will store the value in the buffer area in the main memory. Why in the main memory? Because we know that every operation that is executed in the executed has to be executed in the main memory. Next is write operation. The write operation is an operation that is sending back a value to the database again. If we have updated any value and we want that updated value to be getting stored in the database again, we will be using a operation that is the write operation. Then we can use another operation which is a commit operation. After all instruction of a transaction, if it is successfully getting executed, these changes has to be permanent in the database. So at that time we will be using a operation, commit operation. There are one more operation which is a rollback operation. If a transaction is not able to execute its all operation successfully, at that time the transaction has to be fail, and all the transaction the changes of the transaction which is done in the databases item has to be redone again. It has to be undone and then redone again. If the user user can again redo these operations. Now we will actually go to the state of transactions. So here once the transaction is begin, actually the transaction is what? It is a set of instruction in the read write operation. So once the begin keyword is there, when the transaction finds its begin keyword, it actually is in the state of active state. The transaction is being active. Then after the all the set of instruction, when it is getting executed, the transaction will get to the next state, that is the partially committed state. Once it finds the end, it will get into the partially committed state. Once the commit operation is getting executed in the transaction, it means that all the changes which is done by the transaction is actually getting permanently saved in the databases, and we say that a transaction is entered in the state of committed state. Once the transaction is getting committed, then the next means the task for which we want to begin, or we have begin the transaction, is actually successfully completed. So we just need to terminate it. This is the successful path of the transaction, where the transaction is actually getting started and it is successfully completed. But there may be a certain problems which arise when we execute the transaction. At that time, if suppose you are executing the transaction operation like read and write, and this read and write requires some data item, but if that data item is not available right now, what will happen? The transaction is actually failed. And sometimes when the transaction is actually partially started, it execute, like for example, if the transaction is containing 50 instructions and it executed 25 instruction and 26 operation may for a 25th instruction, it requires some more resources, some more data items. But if that data items are not present, or if there is some logical error, at that time also the transaction is getting aborted because of these reasons. Once the transaction is actually getting aborted, it entered into the next state, that is called failed state. And remember that the failed transaction will never directly go to the active state. It has to be terminated first, and then it needs to again start its execution from begin transactions. So these are the state of transactions, different kind of state of transaction. So let's read the state of transaction. Number one is active state. A transaction enter into the active state when the execution process begins. During this state, read or write operation can be performed. So all the read and write operation which is we have already written in the transaction will getting executed in this particular active state. Partially committed state, a transaction goes into the partially committed state after the end of transaction. Like transaction always starts with the begin keyword and it end with the end keyword. So once the end of the transaction is executed, the transaction is actually in the partially committed state. Then the committed state, when the transaction is committed to state, it has already completed its execution successfully. Moreover, all the changes which is done in the buffer area where the database items are getting stored are sending back its changes to the database permanently. Then fail state, a transaction considered as a fail when any of the checks fail for its transaction is aborted while it is in the active state. If the transaction is in the active state and if it is executed because of some error, the transaction is failed. So it is entered into the failed state. And then last is terminated state. If the transaction is terminated because of the successful transaction, also it can be entered into the terminated state, or because of unsuccessful, if the transaction is failed, it also entered into the terminated state. Terminated state means the state of transaction reach terminated state when the certain transaction which are leaving the system can't be restarted. Okay, once the transaction is being executed successfully, then we need not want the transaction to run again. So at that time we can terminate the transaction. Or sometimes if if there is an error in the transaction and because of the error we just want to cancel the transaction, so we can enter into the terminated state in the transaction. So these are some transaction state. If you find any difficulty, any query regarding the state of transaction, you can write in the comment box.